Moments that freeze time so sharply that you can remember the exact light in the room, the faintest scent in the air, even the feeling of your own pulse against your ribs. When I look back now, that Tuesday afternoon still stands untouched in my memory, so vivid, so precise that it feels less like recollection and more like a scar. It was the day I learned exactly what my place had become in my son's home, and it was the day something inside me quietly shifted, choosing self-preservation over the lifelong instinct to keep giving until there was nothing left to give. I had arrived at Brian and Lauren's house around 3 p.m., the time Brian had told me to stop by and drop off a stack of children's books I had bought for Lily and Noah. Their home was always a place I entered gently, even when I had the key they'd given me years ago for emergencies. I rang the doorbell 3 times before finally letting myself in, calling out softly as I stepped through the front hall. Their living room was comfortingly familiar backpacks leaning against the stairs, tiny shoes, scattered haphazardly, the kind of warm disarray children bring into a home. I remember the faint hum of the dishwasher and the smell of coffee lingering in the air. And then just as I reached the kitchen doorway, I heard my name. Or rather, not my name, but a description of me so cold and sharp that it rooted me to the spot. Lauren's voice drifted from the kitchen, edged with irritation, as she said to my son, "I'm just being realistic, Brian. Your mom's medication costs more than she's worth at this point." The words landed like a physical blow. For a moment, I thought, perhaps I hadn't heard correctly, that maybe the old house had echoed oddly, or that my ears were playing tricks on me, but the silence that followed was unmistakable. Brian didn't disagree. He didn't defend. He didn't even hesitate. He only muttered something vague as if weighing her point. Standing there, holding a glass of water and the pills that kept my heart beating, I felt the edges of my world shift, just slightly off-center. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but once the words were spoken, I couldn't unhear them. I stood frozen, unable to step forward or retreat, staring at the dark carpet where the glass slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. The water spread slowly outward, forming a shimmering stain that blurred around the edges, the way grief sometimes does. The sound drew their attention, and when Brian rounded the corner and saw me, the color drained from his face. He whispered, "Mom." "We didn't know you were here," but the apology he tried to form was already too late. I kept my voice calm, too calm perhaps. I told them I had come to drop off the books and that I'd heard everything. Lauren tried to backtrack and Brian tried to soften the edges of what she'd said, but the moment had crystallized into something undeniable. It wasn't just the cruelty of the words, it was the pretense stripped away, the quiet truth revealed under the casual tone. I left their house without raising my voice, without demanding an apology, without giving them the spectacle they might have expected. Instead, I walked out into the cool air of the afternoon with a stillness inside me, one that felt strange, unfamiliar, and necessary. It was only when I reached my car that the trembling began, subtle at first and then stronger, as I sat behind the steering wheel, trying to understand how a child I had raised, a son I had loved so wholly, could stand silently while someone placed a price tag on my life. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply drove home and let the quiet settle around me, letting the truth take root. When I pulled into my driveway that evening, the sky had turned a soft lavender, the kind of fading light Thomas used to call the hour between heartbeats. I sat there for several long minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the first porch lights flicker on along the street. My neighborhood had always felt safe, steady, a quiet sanctuary tucked away from the chaos of the world. But that night, even the familiar felt tenuous, as if the foundation beneath my life had shifted a few inches to one side. I finally stepped out of the car, walked into my kitchen, and set a kettle of water to boil, needing the comfort of ritual to steady myself. The house creaked the way older homes do in the evening, and as I took my heart medication with the steaming cup of tea, the weight of what I had heard earlier settled into a deeper place within me. It was one thing to feel unappreciated. It was another to hear your worth measured against the cost of staying alive. That night, I lay awake far later than I usually did. I thought about Thomas and how carefully he had planned our future, how he had put away savings and ensured that I would always be taken care of. I thought about the quiet strength he had taught me during our marriage, how he always encouraged me to draw boundaries even when it was painful. I imagined what he might say if he had been in the kitchen with me that afternoon, hearing our daughter-in-law calculate my value like a line item in their budget. I could almost hear him sigh deeply and sadly before saying in that gentle voice he used when things mattered most, "Maggie, if someone shows you who they are, believe them." By the next morning, the clarity from the night before had hardened into something firmer. I sat at the dining table, the same one where Thomas and I had shared meals for 4 decades, and opened my notebook. I wrote down the numbers, not the emotions, not the betrayal, but the plain facts. 3 years of insurance payments, $1,847 each month, 33 months. More than $60,000 spent to ensure that Brian's family had the health care they needed, all while watching myself slowly disappear from their lives. The avoidance, the excuses, the missed birthdays and canceled dinners. Gratitude had faded, replaced with expectation, and expectation had decayed into entitlement. Seeing it laid out in ink made something tighten in my chest. Not anger, something more resolute. I reached for the phone and dialed Denise Porter, my longtime insurance agent. When she answered with her usual warm professionalism, I took a breath and told her I needed to make a change. "I'd like to remove 4 people from my policy," I said. "My son Brian, his wife Lauren, and their children." Denise paused, clearly surprised, but didn't pry. She simply told me she would process the change and that the new arrangement would take effect at the end of the current coverage month. When I hung up, I felt a strange mixture of relief and grief wash over me. Relief because I had taken a step toward reclaiming my life. Grief because it felt like closing a door I had been holding open for far too long. That afternoon, I drafted an email to Brian. My hands trembled slightly as I typed, not from fear, but from the weight of everything left unsaid. I kept it short, clear and calm, far calmer than the storm I suspected it would unleash. I told him the insurance would end on December 31st, that it was not a punishment but a necessary shift, and that I needed to prioritize my own well-being. I told him I loved him, loved the children, but would no longer support a household that viewed me as an expendable burden. When I clicked, send the room felt impossibly still. His first call came 10 minutes later. 6 more followed before the evening was over. I let every one of them ring. The days that followed unfolded with a heaviness I hadn't felt since the weeks after Thomas passed. Brian's calls lit up my phone through the evening, and well into the next morning, messages piling up one after another, pleading at first, then confused, then angry, in that clipped tone he used when the world didn't bend the way he expected. I read each one only once. "Mom, please answer. We need to talk about this. This isn't fair. You're overreacting. We literally can't afford insurance without your help." That last line, meant to guilt me back into place, instead landed with a clarity that strengthened my resolve. For years, I had quietly rearranged my own life to support theirs, skipping dinners with friends, delaying repairs on the house, even putting off a visit to Allison, yet I had never once asked them to consider what it cost me. And now that I'd stopped, it seemed unimaginable to them that I might choose myself. 2 days later, Brian showed up at my door unannounced. I saw his shadow through the frosted glass and felt my heart flutter, not from fear, but from the painful recognition of what this confrontation meant. When he knocked, I didn't answer. I stood in the hallway with my arms wrapped around myself, listening as he called my name through the door with a mixture of frustration and desperation. "Mom, please. We need to talk. This has gone too far." After several minutes of pleading that dissolved into silence, I watched his figure retreat down the walkway. The next afternoon he returned. This time I opened the door but kept the chain latched. The small metal barrier between us felt symbolic in a way that cut deeper than I expected. He stood on the porch with his hands shoved in his pockets, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Mom," he said, voice thick. "This isn't you. You're not the kind of person who turns your back on family." His attempt to define me, shape me back into the version of myself that had always been convenient for him, brought a sharp ache to my chest. I told him quietly that I hadn't turned my back on anyone, that I was simply no longer able to carry a weight that was never mine to bear. When he insisted they couldn't afford health insurance, I asked him what families do every day across this country. They adjust, they sacrifice, they make difficult choices. For the first time in our conversation, he had no reply. When he finally left, the ache didn't ease. I closed the door softly and pressed my forehead against its wood, wishing just for a moment that love did not require so much strength. Lauren reached out next, not with calls, but through a long, carefully crafted text message filled with apologies, shaped like excuses. She said she had been stressed, that she didn't mean what she said, that she valued me deeply. But her words had the hollow ring of someone mourning the loss of a resource, not the loss of a relationship. I didn't respond. The next day, flowers arrived, white lilies in a vase with a satin bow. I gave them to my neighbor. When handmade cards appeared from Lily and Noah, their little drawings and careful lettering nearly shattered my resolve. And for the first time since the incident, tears pricked my eyes. I loved those children more than they could ever understand, and it broke something tender in me to see them caught between adult failings. But love for my grandchildren could not be the leash that dragged me back into quiet suffering. January arrived with its deep winter hush, and for a while the silence between us felt like a wound still bleeding. Then mid-morning one day, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but habit made me pick up. A pleasant professional voice introduced herself as Carla Nguyen from Dr. Ramirez's orthodontic office. She said she was calling about Lily's treatment plan and asked about financial arrangements since, according to their file, I was listed as the guarantor. The air went still around me. I sank slowly into a chair, gripping the phone as Carla explained the $8,400 cost of the braces Lily needed. When I told her calmly that I had never agreed to be responsible for that bill, she hesitated in confusion. Brian, she explained, had written my name on the forms. I felt a cold, hollow space open inside my chest. Even after everything, even after the words that had cut me so deeply, Brian had still assumed I would pay without being asked. When I hung up, it took less than 20 minutes for Brian to call. This time I answered. The moment I pressed the phone to my ear, Brian's voice came through in a burst, angry, panicked, and sharp around the edges. He didn't bother with greetings or pleasantries. He dove straight into accusation, demanding to know why the orthodontist had called him saying, "I refuse to pay for Lily's braces." The incredulity in his tone, this stunned disbelief that I would dare refuse, struck me harder than the anger itself. He spoke as if it were an established fact of the universe that I was responsible for solving his financial crises. "You're really going to do this," he said, his voice rising. "You're going to let your granddaughter suffer because you're mad at us." His words carried the weight of a son who had long ago abandoned the notion that his parent might also be human. I told him calmly that I loved Lily, that I loved Noah, but their medical and dental expenses were his and Lauren's responsibility. The silence that followed was sharp, and in it, I could almost hear him recalibrating, trying to make sense of the new reality I had placed before him. He shifted his argument quickly, trying to paint himself as a victim of circumstance. He listed their bills, their limited insurance, the rising costs of living. He emphasized that the $600 he now paid monthly for inadequate coverage he claimed to have been forced into because of my rash decision was strangling their finances. When he said we had to take the kids out of half their activities, there was a tremor of something like resentment in his voice, as if the burden of responsible parenting were an injustice I had inflicted on him. When he mentioned Lauren going back to full-time work at a job she hated, I felt something deep inside me shift. For years, I had rearranged my own life without complaint, cutting back, sacrificing, adjusting, so that Brian's family could maintain the lifestyle they felt entitled to. And now faced with the first real consequence of their own choices, he spoke to me as though I had betrayed him. I told him that life required responsibility from all of us, and that supporting his family was not my role. We're barely making it. He said, his voice cracking with frustration. And now Lily needs $8,000 of dental work, and you're just sitting there on your pile of money. At that phrase, his words dripping with entitlement, I let out a soft, incredulous laugh. My pile of money. The savings Thomas had spent a lifetime building. The pension he had earned with decades of long shifts. The life insurance meant to care for me in the years after he was gone. Brian saw it not as a nest egg, not as a safeguard, but as a communal pot from which he felt owed a share. My voice rose not in rage, but in something steadier. I reminded him of the more than $60,000 I had already spent on his insurance, the years of quiet sacrifice he had accepted, without thanks the distance he and Lauren had placed between us. I told him that for the first time in 3 years, I was choosing to be selfish. When he threw the accusation back at me, calling me cold, petty, vindictive, I did not flinch. I told him that he needed to figure out a solution the way millions of other parents do, and that I trusted he would because he had no other choice. He ended the call abruptly, furious, and swallowed by a situation he could no longer push onto me. That evening, the weight of the confrontation settled over the house like a thick fog. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, sitting in the quiet while my hands trembled slightly. I had never imagined a day when my relationship with Brian would fracture so completely. I had never envisioned a moment where I would need to choose between my dignity and my son's approval. But as I looked around my living room, the soft lamplight glinting off framed photographs of my children when they were small, I understood something with painful clarity. Love did not mean allowing myself to disappear. In the weeks that followed, I heard nothing from Brian. No calls, no visits, only silence, wide, echoing, and heavy in the way unresolved hurt often is. But then Allison called her voice tight with anger and disbelief after hearing Brian's version of events. She listened in stunned silence as I told the story from the beginning, and by the time I finished, she whispered, "Mom, I'm so angry I could scream." Daniel called days later with that steady warmth in his voice, telling me he would help with Lily's braces if I wanted him to. I refused, of course, but the offer settled warmly in my chest, a reminder that not all my children felt entitled to me. By mid-April, the situation felt like a distant echo, still painful, but less sharp when Lauren appeared on my doorstep, looking pale, drained, and hesitant. I let her in, but only barely. She stood in the foyer, wringing her hands, trying desperately to explain herself, to rewrite the meaning of the words she had spoken in that kitchen. She said she'd been stressed, that she hadn't meant it, that she loved and valued me. She cried openly, saying she didn't know what to do anymore, that they were drowning financially and emotionally. She begged me not to abandon the family. There was a moment when she nearly sank to her knees, whispering that she would grovel if it meant making things right. I listened quiet and steady, and then I told her the truth that some things once broken cannot be repaired, that I wished her and the children well, that I hoped one day time would soften the jagged edges of what had happened, but I would not return to a role that had cost me so much of myself. When she left, slamming the door more out of anguish than anger, the house felt profoundly silent. But it was the kind of silence that brings peace rather than loneliness. The months after Lauren's visit moved slowly, like a river regaining its shape after a sudden storm. I found myself waking each morning with a little more ease, as though my heart had shed a weight it had carried for far too long. There were still moments, of course, brief flashes of guilt, sharp pangs of longing when I passed the children's school or saw a mother and grown son laughing together at the grocery store. But those moments became gentler with time, no longer tied to a sense of obligation or shame. They were simply reminders of love and of the complicated paths it sometimes takes. February blurred into March, and while the air remained cold, a lightness seeped gradually into my days. I took painting classes at the senior center, where the warm hum of conversation and the smell of acrylic paints offered a quiet kind of therapy. I booked a trip with my longtime friends and even visited Allison in Oregon, a trip I had postponed for years in favor of subsidizing someone else's life. I rediscovered small delights breakfast on my porch, the early morning chatter of finches in the backyard, a new recipe that made my kitchen smell like cinnamon and vanilla for an entire afternoon. Somewhere in that stretch of days, I went on a pleasant, tentative date with Edward Collins, a widower from church, who had kind eyes and a way of listening that felt like sunlight slipping into a darkened room. It didn't lead anywhere, but it reminded me that life still held room for possibilities, however unexpected. Then April arrived with its softened winds and early blossoms, and something happened I had quietly hoped for, but didn't dare expect. I ran into Lily and Noah in the grocery store. They were with Lauren, and when Lily spotted me near the produce aisle, her face lit up in a way that stole the breath from my lungs. She ran to me, flung her arms around my waist, and tilted her chin up to show me her braces, shiny silver brackets that glinted under the fluorescent lights, as she declared proudly, "Look, Grandma Maggie, I got them." My heart clenched with such fierce affection that it almost hurt. Noah, older and more cautious, stood back for a moment before giving me a small but genuine hug. Behind them, Lauren hovered silently, her face composed, but her eyes unreadable. We exchanged the briefest of nods, a fragile, wordless truce neither of us dared press too far. "Can we come visit you sometime?" Lily asked, bouncing on her heels. Her hopeful eyes flicked toward her mother, waiting for permission that didn't come. Lauren's gaze remained distant, but she didn't forbid it. "If your mom and dad say yes," I told her gently, "I would love that." The children hugged me again before returning to the cart, their voices bright and excited as they walked away. Lauren guided them toward the bakery aisle without looking back, but there was no anger in her posture, only exhaustion, maybe acceptance or something softer than either. Brian still hasn't called. 7 months of silence have stretched between us like a long, thin shadow. It hurts more than I allow myself to admit even now. I carried him in my body, raised him through scraped knees, and heartbreaks watched him become a man. And somewhere along the way, the space between us widened into a canyon. Neither of us has yet crossed. But I have learned slowly, painfully, that loving someone does not mean surrendering yourself to the versions of them that wound you. Love can exist with boundaries. Love can survive at a distance. Love, if it is real, does not demand your dignity as payment. I think often about that moment in the kitchen, the 7 words that changed everything. Your mom's medication costs more than she's worth. They echo faintly now, no longer sharp enough to pierce me, but clear enough to remind me of truths I needed to see. I am worth more than the money I can give. I am worth more than being tolerated for my usefulness. I am worth more than being spoken about like a burden whose value diminishes with age. I spent decades giving happily, lovingly, but I have come to understand that giving without respect becomes servitude, and servitude masquerading as love can hollow a person from the inside out. Today I am no longer hollow. I am 71 years old. I take medication that keeps my heart beating strong enough to greet each morning. I read, I paint, I laugh with my friends, I visit my daughter. I look forward to the next moment I might run into my grandchildren. My life, my imperfect, fragile, precious life, is still unfolding, and I have no intention of letting it be measured by anyone else's ledger. If you've listened this far, thank you for staying with me. And if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of your own worth, or the importance of boundaries, or the quiet courage of choosing yourself, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your story too, because none of us should walk through moments like these alone.